Hey guys, tonight we step into the hidden world of Japan's most forbidden pleasures. Inside the walls of Yoshiwara, a place where desire was dressed in silk and illusion ruled stronger than law. It's a story of beauty and sorrow, of courtesans who lived as queens, yet remained prisoners. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, let your body soften, your breath slow, as we drift into another time. Step softly, and let us wander together through narrow streets, lined with paper lanterns glowing like fireflies in the dusk. The year is the early 17th century. We are in Edo, the city that would one day become Tokyo. But tonight, it is not the shogun's castle or the samurai's estates that call to us. Tonight we walk toward the gates of a forbidden world. The air carries the scent of incense and faint smoke. Low hum rises from behind wooden walls, laughter mingled with the plucking of shamisen strings. Ahead stands the great gate of Yoshiwara, Edo's licensed pleasure quarter. A city within a city, built on lust and illusion. Once inside, time seems to blur. The world of merchants, warriors, and farmers falls away, replaced by a theater of silk and desire. The Tokugawa shogunate, ever mindful of order, created this place not only to control vice, but also to profit from it. Rather than ban prostitution, they contained it, encircling it with moats and gates, marking it on official maps. Here, corruption was not a secret, but an institution. Yoshiwara became both prison and paradise. For the women within, the streets were gilded cages. For the men outside, the gates promised escape from duty. Step further and you hear the soft shuffle of Geta sandals on the paving stones. Through latticed windows, the figures of courtesans appear, seated in rows like jewels displayed in a shop. Their faces are painted white, their lips a perfect red, their kimonos embroidered with gold and silk. These were not ordinary women, but Oiran, high-ranking courtesans, artists of seduction who commanded the price of a fortune. The Oiran were not simply prostitutes. They were performers of a delicate theater. To be chosen by one was a privilege, not a transaction. A man could not simply toss coins and expect her embrace. He had to woo, to flatter, to spend lavishly on banquets, gifts, and poems. Nights could pass with nothing more than conversation, a dance of wit and charm where the courtesan held the power. And yet, behind the painted masks, their lives were bound in sorrow. Many had been sold into Yoshiwara as children, bound by debts they could never escape. Their beauty was both their weapon and their chain. The higher they rose, the more dazzling the illusion, and the heavier the burden of keeping it. Still, in the lantern light, the illusion sparkled. The streets of Yoshiwara became a dreamscape where samurai drank beside merchants, where actors mingled with poets, where rules of class dissolved in the haze of sake. For a price, one could forget the rigid order of Edo, could drift into a world where laughter, music, and silk wrapped around the senses. Listen, and you can almost hear the shamisen strings. The notes rise and fall like waves, carrying you deeper into the floating world, the Ukiyo, as it was called. A world not of permanence, but of fleeting pleasures. A world designed to vanish with the dawn. Within the tea houses, men recited haiku while courtesans replied with poetry of their own. Cups of sake passed from hand to hand, the rim warm with breath. Laughter echoed, but beneath it lay something quieter, the hunger of men seeking escape, the sorrow of women who gave themselves as dreams. This was the paradox of Yoshiwara, a place of joy yet built on suffering, a place of freedom yet enclosed by walls. a place where love was acted, bought, and sold, yet where sometimes true longing flickered to life despite the rules. And so, as you drift through the streets of lanterns, you begin to sense it, the heartbeat of a world both beautiful and cruel, a world that history would later paint in vivid woodblock prints. Its women immortalized with flowing hair and exquisite kimonos, their smiles frozen in time. But behind every painted smile lay a story of power, of corruption, of twisted desire. And those stories, whispered gently in the dark, are what we shall explore together. Breathe slowly now, in through the nose, out through the lips, and let the story carry you. The night inside Yoshiwara was never truly dark. Lanterns burned through the hours, their soft orange glow painting the wooden streets in shifting shadows. It was an illusion of eternal twilight, a place where the sun's rules did not apply, and where time itself seemed to pause at the gates. But behind the glow and laughter lay a system as rigid and structured as any temple. Yoshiwara had its rituals, its own hierarchy, and its own laws. Laws shaped by the Tokugawa shogunate, yet written in the language of desire. At the very top stood the Taiyu and the Oiran, courtesans of such high rank that even daimyo lords approached them with trembling hands. They were artists, philosophers, and companions of intellect as much as flesh. Their lives were orchestrated like theater, the way they walked, the way they poured sake, the way they spoke in carefully measured tones. Each gesture was deliberate, rehearsed, perfected until it appeared effortless. To meet an Oiran was no simple transaction. A man had to prove himself worthy through a slow, expensive courtship known as the Nakaya-di. First came the introduction at the tea house, where he would sit across the room, watching as she entered with attendants trailing behind. She would bow ever so slightly, her eyes lowered, her lips curved in a knowing half-smile. He could not approach. Not yet. He must wait. If his gifts were grand enough, silken robes, lacquered combs, or a feast of exotic delicacies, then he might be granted a second meeting. Apps! Then she would speak to him. Soft words, layered with riddles, poems, and sly jokes, designed to tease his pride and ignite his imagination. Only on the third or even fourth meeting, after he had invested heavily in both treasure and time, would the possibility of intimacy unfold. And even then, nothing was guaranteed. This was the power of the courtesan. She was not simply selling her body, but the performance of unattainable desire. To possess her was to win a prize that many sought but few could afford. The illusion was everything. The illusion of choice, of conquest, of love. But behind the silk screens and painted lips, the truth was far less romantic. Many of these women had been sold into Yoshiwara as young girls, often by impoverished families who could no longer feed them. Contracts bound them in years, sometimes decades of service, debts that grew rather than shrank. Their beauty was their currency, but it was also their chain. Yet within the prison, some rose to wield extraordinary influence. The most famous Oiran could command sums that rivaled the wealth of a small estate. Men of high rank would duel with poetry and coin to win her attention. Actors and poets immortalized their names in plays and woodblock prints. They became celebrities, adored and envied, yet still trapped behind the gates. Listen closely now. Imagine the sound of silk sliding across a tatami mat. The quiet laughter of a courtesan as she pours a cup of sake, her sleeves falling back to reveal pale wrists adorned with jade. to clatter of dice rolling in a wooden bowl as men gamble beneath the haze of tobacco smoke. Outside, snow drifts silently against the gates. But within, the air is warm, thick with the mingled scents of sake and perfume. You're in this world of shadows and light. Scandal flourished. Samurai forbidden to spend too much in the quarter often pawned their swords, their very symbols of honor, just to afford one more night with their chosen courtesan. Merchants, officially considered lowly in rank, found themselves treated like kings once they crossed the gates, their purses fat with coin. And actors, already adored on stage, came to Yoshiwara to chase another kind of fame, basking in the reflected glow of courtesans who chose them. Whispers drifted through the night of secret affairs between courtesans and powerful lords, of illegitimate children hidden away, of alliances forged not on battlefields but in perfumed chambers. The pleasure houses were not merely dens of lust, but arenas of power. A well-placed whisper from a courtesan could ruin a man's reputation or elevate another's fortunes. And always the illusion was maintained. Even the walk of the Oiran was ritualized, a slow, deliberate procession through the streets of Yoshiwara, her attendants trailing. Her hair piled high with ornaments, her kimono layered in heavy silks. She moved at a pace so deliberate, so excruciatingly slow, that it forced all eyes to linger. Men lined the streets, holding their breath, watching each step as if witnessing a goddess descending to earth. But do not be deceived. Behind the elegance lay exhaustion. The hairpins weighed heavily. The layers of silk stifled the body. The makeup hid both fatigue and sorrow. Yet the performance had to go on. For the courtesan's survival depended on the illusion that she was untouchable, otherworldly, divine, and so the night stretched endlessly. Inside the tea houses, laughter echoed, cups clinked, songs were sung. Men recited verses of bashu and sakaku, while courtesans replied with their own sharp wit. Conversations turned from love to politics, from poetry to scandal. All the while, the courtesans listened, storing secrets, weaving them into power, because in Yoshiwara, secrets were the most valuable currency of all. It was said that the floating world mirrored life itself, fleeting, impermanent, bittersweet. To enter Yoshiwara was to step into a dream you knew would vanish at dawn. But the dream was irresistible, and for many it became an addiction. Some men lost fortunes here, some lost honor. Few even lost their lives, unable to bear the shame of debts they could never repay. For others, though, Yoshiwara offered a taste of freedom they could find nowhere else, a chance to escape duty, class, and consequence, if only for a night. And so the lanterns kept burning, the shamisen kept playing, and the courtesans, behind their painted masks, kept smiling. For Yoshiwara was a stage, and every visitor, Lord Merchant or poet, was both actor and audience in the grandest performance of all. And yet deeper within the quarter, away from the glowing streets in the parade of Oiran, darker truths waited to be uncovered. We will go there next. The lanterns of Yoshiwara burned bright, but not every corner of the district glowed with silk and laughter. Behind the grand processions of Oiran, behind the ritualized elegance of the tour, there existed another world, a world less gilded, less merciful, yet just as real. Not every woman in Yoshiwara rose to fame. In fact, most never would. Far from the spotlight of the grand tea houses, there were the lower-ranked courtesans, known as Koshijoro or Komoro, and later, as they aged or fell from favor, the Yobadashi and Tikomae. These women did not command poetry in processions. Their nights were filled with long hours, endless clients, and far less choice. Imagine now a narrow alley lit by fewer lanterns. The light flickers dimmer here, and the air is heavier, tinged with sweat and smoke instead of perfume. Behind sliding doors, laughter rises, but it is louder, less refined. With the sound of dice clattering against wood and drunken shouts slurring in the dark, here, pleasure was cheapened, and so too were the women. While the Oiran staged elaborate rituals that took days of courting, these women were expected to please quickly, efficiently, without the luxury of choice. Their makeup was simpler, their kimonos thinner, their gestures less rehearsed. Many entered the trade as children, sold by families drowning in poverty, bound by contracts they could not escape. And yet, even in this shadowed world, rituals persisted. A woman would still greet her client with a bow, still pour his sake, still pretended affection, because to break the illusion was to risk punishment. But the masks grew heavier here. Listen closely. Can you hear it? The muffled sob of a girl only 12 or 13 years old. Her voice hidden behind the sliding door as she steels herself for another night. The clink of coins tossed onto the floor. Payment for hours that will leave her body bruised and her spirit fractured. Outside, the revelers shout, but within, silence suffocates. This was the other face of Yoshiwara. For every celebrated courtesan who graced the woodblock prince, there were dozens whose names would never be remembered. They lived and died within the walls of the brothels, their contracts binding them until age or illness took them. And once their beauty faded, many were discarded, left to beg in the streets, or worse, to die unnamed, their ashes scattered with no mourners. Disease lurked constantly in these houses. The air, heavy with smoke and sweat, carried infections easily. Syphilis spread like wildfire, leaving courtesans scarred and broken long before their contracts ended. The shogunate, aware of the danger, established medical inspections, but these were crude, consistent, and often ignored in favor of profit. And yet, even within the shadows, there were flickers of resistance. Some courtesans learned to manipulate their clients, extracting gifts or favors that could one day be bartered into freedom. A few managed to pay off their debts, often with the help of wealthy patrons who sought to keep them exclusively. Others used their wit, their memory, their ability to gather secrets. They became confidants, informants, even silent blackmailers, wielding information as a weapon more potent than any blade. Still, for most, the gates of Yoshiwara remained closed. Picture this now, the great walls that encircled the district, gates that shut at night, trapping the women inside. To many it felt like a prison, the world outside glimpsed only through rumors and fleeting shadows. Lanterns glowed like false stars, but the sky beyond was hidden. Freedom was a dream, fleeting, unattainable. And yet men kept coming. Night after night, they poured through the gate, seeking escape, seeking fantasy, seeking the illusion that within Yoshiwara, they could be whoever they wished. Samurai without duty, merchants without rank, lords without responsibility. It was, as the poet said, the Ukiyo, the floating world, a realm detached from the burdens of reality. But it was a world built on the backs of women whose lives were anything but free. And beneath it all, scandal brewed. There were whispers of uprisings within the brothels, of courtesans who attempted escape, of fires that conveniently consumed entire quarters when debts grew too heavy. Fires were frequent in Yoshiwara, so frequent that some suspected they were set deliberately, erasing both records and lives. After each blaze, the district would rebuild, more lavish, more dazzling, as though the flames themselves had become part of its mythology. But the women never forgot. Each time the walls rose higher, each time the lanterns burned brighter, the truth pressed heavier. That this world, this so-called paradise of pleasure, was also a gilded cage. And yet, there was beauty here too. Listen now. Hear the sound of the shamisen drifting across the night, a melancholy tune played by a courtesan who has just finished her duties. She plays not for clients, but for herself. A song of longing, of remembrance, of a home far away. For a moment the lantern light softens, the air grows lighter, and the pain fades into music. For this was the paradox of Yoshiwara. It was a place of dreams and a place of despair. A place where beauty was worshipped and where beauty was consumed. And a place of silk and shackles, laughter and sorrow, illusions and truth. The floating world lived because it dazzled, because it concealed. But not all secrets could remain hidden. For behind the veils of Yoshiwara lay stories of forbidden love, political intrigue, of scandals so shocking it threatened to reach beyond the gates and into the highest courts of Japan itself. And that is where we will wander next. Yoshiwara may have been locked by gates each night, but whispers have always had a way of slipping through. The floating world was never truly sealed. Its secrets drifted like smoke, curling into the courts of daimyo, the gardens of samurai, even the chambers of the shogun himself. Because inside those lantern-lit rooms, courtesans heard everything. Imagine it now. A lord, loosened by sake, boasting of land he intends to seize. A merchant whispering about a bribe offered to an official. A samurai confessing his debts, his shame, his hidden lover waiting beyond the gates. Each word, each sigh, each drunken confession, falling upon the delicate ears of women trained not only in the arts of pleasure, but also in the art of listening. And so Yoshiwara became more than a district of desire. It became a web of secrets. Some courtesans wielded those secrets carefully, tucking them away like folded poems. Others sold them quietly to interested parties. A rival merchant, a political foe, even spies employed by rival domains. In a world where information was often more dangerous than swords, Yoshiwara became both a sanctuary and a battlefield. And at the center of many of these intrigues were the Oiran, high-ranking courtesans, dressed in towering kimonos and ornate hairpieces glittering with tortoiseshell and jade, commanded not only beauty, but also influence. Their processions through the streets drew crowds, but behind closed doors, their clients were often men of immense power, lords, magistrates, advisors to the shogun. It is whispered that some decisions of state were first tested in those very rooms, floated across a pillow, before ever reaching an official council chamber. Because men spoke differently when their armor was set aside. When their heads rested upon the lap of a courtesan who stroked their hair with painted fingers. But these liaisons carried danger. Forbidden romances often bloomed. Dangerous, intoxicating affairs between courtesans and samurai who risked everything for love. To fall for a courtesan was to invite ruin, for their contracts bound them, and to steal them away was considered a crime. Yet the heart rarely obeys the law. One tale, often whispered, though rarely written, tells of a samurai who sold his sword, his very symbol of honor, just to buy the freedom of a woman trapped in Yoshiwara. Another speaks of a courtesan who, upon learning her lover had been betrayed in order to commit seppuku, cut her own throat in solidarity, staining her silk robes crimson before dawn. Such stories lingered like ghosts. The pleasure houses themselves seemed to feed on these tragedies, each wall absorbing the sighs, the laughter, the sobs that played out night after night. And still, the scandals grew. Merchants often sought to flaunt their wealth by becoming patrons of famous Oiran, rivaling each other with extravagant gifts, lacquer boxes, silk gowns, even entire houses. But beneath the surface, these competitions sometimes masked darker dealings, smuggling schemes, bribery networks, or hidden debts. When a merchant fell from favor, the courtesan who once entertained him could suddenly become a dangerous witness. Some women leveraged this power brilliantly. They gathered patrons not only for their bodies, but for their influence, weaving networks of protection that shielded them when others were discarded. There were courtesans who could summon favors from daimyo, who had the ears of city officials, who knew exactly which debts weighed down which samurai. In this way, the floating world mirrored the real one. Behind the illusions of perfume and painted lips, Yoshiwara was deeply political, and the shogunate knew it. Though Yoshiwara was technically under strict regulation, officials often turned a blind eye to its deeper entanglements. Some historians even suggest that certain magistrates preferred to allow the district's vices to flourish because it kept the lords distracted, drained their fortunes, and lulled their ambitions. What better way to control a restless elite than to let them lose themselves in silken cages? But scandals could not always be contained. There were incidents, quiet then loud. When the secrets of Yoshiwara spilled beyond its gates, a lord bankrupted by his obsession with a courtesan, a magistrate disgraced when his bribes were revealed by a lover he thought loyal, family line destroyed because a samurai chose desire over duty, and behind each ruin, a courtesan's shadow lingered. Some embraced this power, others were crushed beneath it. Because to hold a man's secret was to risk his wrath as much as his gratitude. More than one courtesan was silenced, not by the shogunate, but by men who feared what she might reveal. Their deaths were often written off as illness, accident, or despair. Few dared to question. Still, the story spread outside Yoshiwara, in the tea houses of Edo, in the pages of whispered novels. The lives of courtesans became legend. The floating world was romanticized, its tragedies softened into tales of star-crossed lovers, its scandals transformed into cautionary fables. But those who lived inside its walls knew the truth, that Yoshiwara was both theater and prison, a stage where desire and corruption played endlessly. Picture now, a lantern-lit room, the hush of night heavy outside, and within, a man whispers a confession into the ear of a courtesan. She smiles softly, stroking his cheek, her painted lips curved in reassurance. But in her mind, she is already calculating. The secret he has given her may be the key to her freedom, or the reason for her destruction. That was the reality of Yoshiwara. Every sigh could be weaponized. Every caress carried risk. Every night blurred the line between survival and ruin. So the floating world endured, dazzling and dangerous, a mirror of Japan itself, its beauty, its corruption, its capacity for both pleasure and despair. But the story does not end here. For Yoshiwara, like all great illusions, was destined to face collapse. And when it burned, as it so often did, the ashes carried away more than wood and silk. They carried away stories, scandals, lives that history tried to erase. And in the embers, one question always lingered: who truly controlled the floating world? The men who entered its gates, or the women who lived within them? Yoshiwara was built to shimmer like a dream, but dreams are fragile, and fire is merciless. Over its centuries of existence, the pleasure quarter of Edo burned again and again. Some fires were accidents, a candle knocked over, an oil lamp tipped by clumsy hands. Others, whispers claimed, were deliberate. Rivalries, revenge, or even the desperate hands of courtesans seeking escape. The districts with sandpaper houses, so delicate, so beautiful, were also tinderboxes. Lanterns glowed against painted screens, sake sloshed in lacquer cups, silk brushed against open flames. When fire came, it moved faster than any blade. Imagine the night of the Great Yoshiwara Fire of 1657. Edo itself was already ablaze, the sky painted red with smoke and sparks. Inside the walled quarter, panic spread. Courtesans in their long trailing robes, weighted with hair ornaments, struggled to flee. The gates, once symbols of control, became choke points. Many never made it out. The aftermath was unspeakable. Bodies, ashes, jewels melted into blackened lumps. And yet, within months, Yoshiwara rose again, rebuilt with the same fragile materials, the same glittering facades, because Edo could not live without its floating world. But each fire left its mark. Superstition grew around the flames. Some said the fires were divine punishment for the sins committed nightly in Yoshiwara, a cleansing demanded by the gods. Others whispered that the courtesans themselves invoked the flames, their trapped spirits calling out for freedom. One story, often told in hushed tones, speaks of a courtesan named Takigawa. She was famed for her beauty, courted by lords and merchants alike, but imprisoned by debts she could never repay. It is said she prayed to the gods for deliverance. That very night, a fire broke out in her brothel. When the flames cleared, Takigawa was gone. Some claimed she perished. Others believed she escaped. Her body never found. Her name forever swallowed in smoke. Such tales blurred the line between tragedy and myth. And yet fire was not always ruin. Sometimes it was opportunity. After each blaze, the balance of power shifted. Merchants who had lost fortunes rebuilding their establishments found themselves indebted to new rivals. Courtesans whose patrons had died or disappeared were reassigned, their destinies rewritten. Brothel owners used the fires as excuses to renegotiate contracts, erase debts, or reshape alliances. For the women of Yoshiwara, fire could be both executioner and liberator. Still, the district never learned. Every reconstruction repeated the same pattern: beautiful wooden houses, paper screens, lantern-lit halls. Why? Because Yoshiwara was never about safety. It was about illusion. To rebuild with stone or iron would have stripped away the fantasy, the floating world's dreamlike glow. And so they rebuilt in fragile splendor, knowing destruction was inevitable. And in the ashes, new scandals always emerged. After the fire of 1787, rumors spread that officials pocketed funds meant for reconstruction, while courtesans starved in temporary huts. Some brothel owners grew rich in the chaos, purchasing women cheaply from desperate families. who saw the fire as an omen that their daughters might finally earn back their price. For others, the flames became a cruel excuse to extend contracts. Debts were said to have been destroyed in the blaze, only to be rewritten, inflated, impossible to pay. The courtesans knew better than to trust the promises of men with ledgers. And yet, amidst the ruin, Yoshiwara never failed to revive its glitter. Visitors returned in droves, fascinated by the notion of pleasure resurrected from ashes. Some even found a dark thrill in bedding courtesans whose very robes smelled faintly of smoke, as if carrying the scent of destruction. It was as though Yoshiwara itself had become addicted to burning. Destruction, feeding desire, ruin, giving way to renewal, a cycle both cursed and inevitable. Artists captured these fires in Ukiyo-e prints, not as tragedies, but as spectacles. The floating world on fire, women fleeing with hairpins sparkling, men rushing with buckets of water, too small to matter. Even destruction was made into theater. But behind the prints, behind the stories told in tea houses, the survivors remembered differently. Some carried burn scars, hidden beneath silk sleeves. Some lost their sisters, their children, their own voices in the smoke. And yet they returned to paint their faces, to laugh behind painted lips, to pour sake into trembling cups. Because what else could they do? The floating world was not simply a prison. It was survival. And so Yoshiwara kept burning, century after century. Each time Edo wept. Each time Yoshiwara rose again. It became a cycle the city accepted, even anticipated, as though fire was part of the district's allure, its punishment, its promise. For the men who entered those gates, the fire was a distant story, a tale to murmur as they sipped sake, as they pressed lips to painted mouths. But for the women who lived there, every flicker of a candle was a reminder. Freedom could come as flame, or ruin could descend as smoke. Picture it now. Courtesan kneels before a lacquered mirror, brushing rouge onto her lips. Outside, lanterns sway, paper walls creak. She hears a shout, smells the faintest whiff of burning oil. Her hand trembles. Is it merely a neighbor's kitchen fire? Or the beginning of another inferno that will erase everything she knows? That was Yoshiwara, always poised between ecstasy and ashes. Always a floating world, forever at risk of sinking. Inside the walls of Yoshiwara, long before a customer ever laid eyes upon a courtesan, a performance was already underway. It began in silence, behind painted folding screens, where the women of the quarter transformed themselves into living illusions. The preparation was an ordeal of ritual, patience, and pain. Hair came first. Courtesans' hairstyles were not simple affairs, but elaborate constructions of wax, pins, and ornaments. Some styles weighed several pounds, the hair twisted into towering shapes that could last for days without being undone. For the highest-ranking courtesans, the Oiran hair was not simply decoration, but a crown of power. Each ornament carried meaning. Tortoiseshell combs symbolizing longevity, jeweled pins signaling rank, and silken cords braided in patterns known only to the most skilled attendants. To sit while one's hair was pulled, lacquered, and stabbed with needles of metal and bone could take hours. Yet the courtesans bore it with practiced serenity, even as their scalps ached, because beauty was their weapon and survival. Next came the face. White rice powder was applied, layer upon layer, until the skin appeared smooth, pale, almost otherworldly. This whiteness was not merely fashion. In Edo Japan, pale skin symbolized refinement, distance from labor. And in Yoshiwara, it made courtesans resemble dolls of porcelain, fragile yet untouchable. Rouge was brushed onto the lips, painted not fully but in soft shapes, a fashion meant to give the illusion of smaller, pursed mouths. Black ink was drawn onto the teeth, a practice called ohaguro. To outsiders, blackened teeth might seem grotesque. But in Edo, it was the mark of maturity, sensuality, and erotic mystery. The eyes, though, they could not be disguised. Many courtesans learned to harden them, to practice a gaze that looked both inviting and distant. Customers said their eyes shimmered like water, but water can hide stones and drown the unwary. The body, too, was prepared. Silk robes were chosen not for comfort, but for effect. The most prestigious Oiran wore layers upon layers, heavy silk embroidered with phoenixes, dragons, or waves. The weight was suffocating, and in summer unbearable, yet these robes declared status. The higher the rank, the more elaborate the costume. A courtesan could not even walk like an ordinary woman. The highest courtesans adopted a gait called the soto hachi, where each step forced the knees outward, slow and deliberate. It made them appear regal, distant, unattainable. The effect was mesmerizing and exhausting. Beneath their robes, many women bled from sores on their thighs and hips, their bodies bruised from the burden of beauty. But the rituals did not end there. Attendants, often young girls apprenticed into the trade, played their own roles. They scrubbed the courtesans, carried water, brushed hair, and whispered encouragement. Yet these attendants were also reminders of the cycle. For many of them would, in time, become courtesans themselves, their futures already sealed. The very women they served were their mirrors of tomorrow. By the time a courtesan was ready to meet a guest, she was no longer herself. She had been remade into an illusion, hair gleaming, lips red as lacquer, skin white as paper, robes glowing in candlelight. Every detail was meant to ensnare the senses, to create the fantasy of perfection. And yet behind those painted faces, exhaustion and despair often lingered. One observer, a samurai who recorded his visit to Yoshiwara in the 18th century, wrote that when he first glimpsed an Oiran descending the stairs, he thought she was a goddess. But later that night, as she poured him sake, he noticed her hands trembled. Her fingers were calloused from endless hours of preparation, and when she smiled, it seemed to flicker, as though it were painted on not just her lips, but her soul. Preparation was not only physical, it was mental. Courtesans rehearsed witty responses, practiced songs on the shamisen, memorized poems, and learned the subtle art of conversation. They were entertainers as much as lovers. To fail at pleasing a guest's mind was as dangerous as failing to please his body. The scandals of preparation often went untold. There were whispers of attendants stealing hair ornaments, of brothel owners punishing courtesans who failed to meet impossible beauty standards. Some women fainted during the long hours of dressing, only to be revived with sake and forced to continue. But there was also power in the ritual. For in those hours of preparation, courtesans gathered together, whispered secrets, and built alliances. Behind the screens, they shared warnings about cruel clients, rumors about officials, and gossip about rivals. Preparation was a prison, yes, but it was also a sanctuary, a place where the women themselves could, for a few stolen moments, be real. It was during preparation that plots were hatched. One courtesan might whisper of a patron she hoped to ensnare into paying her debts. Another might confess that she planned to fake illness to avoid a night with a cruel customer. In this hidden world behind painted screens, the floating world's truest faces emerged. And so, by the time the sliding doors opened and a courtesan appeared to her waiting guest, she was not simply a woman. She was a creation, the result of hours of pain, ritual, and quiet rebellion. The guest would see only the illusion, the glowing face, the heavy silk, the graceful steps. He would sip sake and believe he was in the company of a goddess. But behind the goddess was a woman, tired, painted, plotted, and prepared to survive another night. That was the ritual of Yoshiwara, a daily transformation repeated endlessly until the courtesans themselves became ghosts of the illusions they performed. And in that endless preparation lay the cruelest scandal of all. That the beauty men desired most was built upon suffering they never saw. The floating world was never just about lust. Behind the lantern-lit streets of Yoshiwara, politics thrived in silence, whispered over cups of sake, hidden in the folds of silk, and sealed with kisses that cost more than gold. To understand the power of the pleasure houses, we must look first at their owners. These brothel masters, called Aja, were not mere innkeepers. They were gatekeepers of desire, men and sometimes women, who controlled the flow of bodies, beauty, and influence. Every guest who entered their doors was catalogued. Samurai lords, wealthy merchants, poets, even magistrates, all came seeking pleasure, and all left trails of secrets behind. A courtesan was rarely just a courtesan. She was a vessel for information. Guests flushed with drink and arousal let words slip. A daimyo might complain of rival lords, a merchant might boast of smuggling rice past the shogun's tax collectors, a government official might hint at bribes or confess which judge could be bought. The courtesan, appearing to laugh lightly and pour more sake, was in truth storing every word like a weapon. It is said that in the 18th century, one Oiran named Tako became notorious for her sharp tongue. She entertained samurai who governed Edo, and with each meeting, she learned the intrigues of the city. She passed her knowledge to her brothel master, who then sold it, not for coin, but for favors. Officials were blackmailed, merchants ruined, enemies silenced. Taka herself became a legend, but also a warning. No secret was safe inside the pleasure houses. The Yoshiwara district was, in many ways, a government-sanctioned trap. By confining vice within its walls, the Tokugawa shogunate believed they controlled it. They created a gilded cage where men could indulge, far from the eyes of their wives and retainers. But in doing so, they also created a place where corruption could bloom unchecked. Money flowed endlessly into Yoshiwara. A single night with an Oiran could cost more than a farmer's annual income. Merchants forbidden from wearing lavish clothing by sumptuary laws flaunted their wealth here instead, spending fortunes on silks and perfumes. Samurai, trapped in the rigid hierarchy of Edo society, escaped their frustrations by losing themselves in the arms of courtesans. Officials who could not be bribed in daylight often found their resolve softened beneath lantern light. This created an economy of corruption. Brothel owners became bankers of secrets. Courtesans became brokers of influence. The more powerful the client, the more dangerous the liaison. There were scandals, of course, whispered in the back streets. One tale tells of a magistrate who fell deeply in love with a courtesan. He spent so recklessly on her that he bankrupted his household. His retainers, desperate to save their honor, murdered him before his debts were exposed. The courtesans spared no pity. was sold again by her brothel master to another client. Her beauty now blood-stained, her price only higher. Another story recounts how rival brothel owners used courtesans as spies. A merchant house that sold rice attempted to corner the market by bribing officials. Their plot might have succeeded had not a courtesan, lying half-naked beside one of the conspirators, overheard their scheme. She whispered it to her brothel master, who in turn sold the information to their rivals. By morning, fortunes had shifted, and the conspirators were disgraced. The courtesan, praised for her sharp ears, was rewarded not with freedom, but with more elaborate robes, a heavier prison made of silk. Even the shogunate itself could not ignore the power of Yoshiwara. Officials were sent to monitor the district, but many were seduced instead. There were rumors never written in the official records that courtesans sometimes worked directly with spies, feeding information to the government in exchange for protection. Some brothel owners grew so influential they were untouchable, their establishments flourishing even when others fell. It was corruption wrapped in beauty, politics disguised as passion. But perhaps the strangest layer of this politics was the role of favored patrons. A wealthy man could, over time, buy the rights to see only one courtesan. This exclusive relationship was called gerbina. To outsiders, it appeared romantic, the fantasy of devotion in a world of lust. But in truth, it was transactional. The patron guaranteed steady income to the brothel, and in return, the courtesan was shielded from other clients. Yet such arrangements were fragile. Patrons sometimes failed to keep up with payments. Courtesans sometimes fell in love with other men. And when these bonds broke, they broke violently. There are records of duels fought outside Yoshiwara's gates. Men stabbing each other over women who were legally property of their brothel. One merchant burned down his own warehouse after losing his courtesan to a rival patron. Another samurai, humiliated when his beloved was sold to another, committed seppuku outside the gates, staining the district's entrance with blood. In this way, Yoshiwara became not only a theater of lust, but of ruin. A single woman's smile could topple fortunes, destroy families, and bend politics. And always, behind her, the brothel owner counted the coins. The politics of the pleasure houses were built on silence. The unspoken agreement that what happened in Yoshiwara stayed in Yoshiwara. But silence was never free. Secrets had prices. And those who could not pay with coin paid with shame, ruin, or blood. Imagine, then, lying in a candlelit room, the soft clink of a shamisen echoing down the hall. A courtesan leans closer, her robe sliding open just enough to distract. She pours sake, whispers in your ear, laughs at your jokes. And without realizing it, you confess something no one else has heard. A bribe you took, fortune you lost, a rival you hate. In the morning, you will leave Yoshiwara believing it was just a night of pleasure. But the courtesan remembers. The brothel owner remembers. And somewhere, someone is already deciding how much your secret is worth. That was the true scandal of Yoshiwara. Not only the selling of bodies, but the selling of souls. For all the shimmering robes, the glittering lanterns, the illusion of freedom, Yoshiwara was still a prison. Every courtesan who entered those gates did so in chains. Not iron, but debts. Families sold daughters into brothels when poverty grew unbearable. Others were tricked, promised work as seamstresses or entertainers, only to find themselves bound by contracts they could never repay. A courtesan's life was purchased in advance by her brothel, and until her debt was cleared, Often decades later, she belonged entirely to her master. The world outside called them flowers, but inside they called themselves birds in a cage. At first glance, the cage glittered. Courtesans wore layers of silk embroidered with cranes and blossoms, their hair lacquered into elaborate towers decorated with combs and pins. They walked with slow, graceful steps, each movement rehearsed to perfection. To the untrained eye, they seemed queens of the night, but every detail of their beauty was a mask. Beneath the robes were bruises from punishments. Behind the smiles were teeth rotted from cheap sock. Their lives were carefully staged performances designed to keep the illusion alive for clients and to keep the profits flowing for their owners. Those who tried to escape faced cruelty that few survived. It was not uncommon for a desperate courtesan to slip through the gates of Yoshiwara at dawn, her hair unpinned, her sandals clattering on the cobblestones as she fled toward the river. But the district was ringed with guards, and outside she was marked as property. A woman with painted brows, white powder on her face, and robes too fine for her station. She could not hide. Captured runaways were dragged back through the gates, paraded as warnings. Punishments were public, theatrical, designed to crush hope. Some were locked in wooden cages at the entrance of the district, their names announced so that every visitor knew they had defied their masters. Others were forced to stand half-naked in the cold, mocked by passers-by until their spirit broke. There were even stories of women branded with heated irons, scars that marked them forever as disobedient. And yet, even knowing the risks, some still tried. One tale tells of a courtesan named Ukiyo-e. She fell in love with a young samurai who promised to rescue her. They plotted in secret, whispering plans between embraces, exchanging hidden letters. One night, Ukiyo-e slipped from her brothel and met him at the gates, but the samurai never came. Instead, the guards were waiting. It was said her brothel master ordered her beaten until her beauty was ruined, then sold her to a cheaper house where she died within the year. Her story became a ghost tale, retold in hushed voices by the other women. Another story lingers about a courtesan called Hannah. Unlike many, she had a sharp wit and saved carefully from her clients' gifts. At last, she gathered enough to buy her freedom. But on the night her papers were to be signed, a fire broke out in her brothel. Trapped by flames, Hannah perished with her savings beside her. Some whispered that the fire was no accident, that her brothel owner had burned the building to erase her contract. Her ashes became a symbol of the futility of escape. Fires, in fact, haunted Yoshiwara. The district was built of wood and paper. Lanterns hung everywhere, incense constantly burning. Entire rows of brothels were reduced to ash in a single night. The women, locked inside their chambers to prevent escape, often died screaming behind barred windows. After each blaze, new brothels rose from the ruins, as if nothing had happened. The cycle of fire and rebuilding mirrored the cycle of the women's lives. Destruction, and then the same prison rebuilt again. Even for those who never attempted escape, the weight of debt was suffocating. A courtesan's contract often grew heavier with each passing year. The robes she wore, the makeup she used, the meals she ate, all were charged against her. Clients might shower her with gifts, but the brothel master took most of them, recording the rest as partial payments against her impossible balance. Few women ever earned enough to leave. The cruel irony was that the highest-ranking courtesans, the Oiran, often had the greatest debts. Their luxuries were their shackles. The more beautiful they were, the more elaborate their robes, the more impossible their freedom became. And when beauty faded, as it always did, the fall was merciless. Older courtesans were often discarded, sold to cheaper houses, or forced into servitude as attendants to younger women. Some became madams themselves, profiting from the suffering of others. Many more drifted into poverty, their faces unrecognizable beneath the layers of powder that once made them desirable. For those who broke completely, there was only one escape left: death. Suicide was a constant shadow in Yoshiwara. Some women swallowed poison, others hung themselves with their own obi sashes. Their ghosts were said to linger in the narrow alleys, their weeping carried on the wind. In Japanese folklore, these restless spirits were called yurei, women wronged in life, doomed to haunt the living. Visitors claimed to see them near the Sumida River, pale figures in torn kimono, waiting for the lovers who never came. And yet, in the face of so much despair, beauty still blossomed. Courtesans wrote poetry in their spare hours, verses that spoke of longing and sorrow. They painted, they played the shamisen, they composed letters to lovers, real and imagined. Some became muses for great poets and artists. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints immortalized their faces, turning their fleeting beauty into art that endured beyond their deaths. This was the strange duality of the floating world. It celebrated pleasure, but was built on pain. Imagine lying in a tatami room, the scent of incense filling your lungs. A courtesan kneels before you, her kimono slipping from her shoulder as she pours sake. Her voice is soft, her laughter light. She seems like a goddess, untouchable, radiant. But behind her smile is exhaustion. Behind her painted face is a girl who once dreamed of freedom, now crushed beneath the weight of debt. And when she leans closer, when her lips almost brush your ear, you must wonder, is it desire she offers, or is it a silent plea for escape? That was the hidden tragedy of Yoshiwara. Beauty sold, bodies consumed, lives extinguished. All so that men could lose themselves in the fleeting illusions of a floating world. For all the cruelty, the punishments, the endless chains of debt, Yoshiwara was also a theater. Every night, its lantern-lit streets transformed into a stage where the courtesans performed not just their bodies, but their art, their intelligence, their very selves. Men did not come only for the embrace of flesh. They came to be enchanted, to be disarmed, to be dazzled by women who had turned survival into spectacle. And so, in the floating world, courtesans became artists. Inside their brothel chambers, the air was thick with more than perfume. There were verses of poetry whispered against silk screens, songs played on the shamisen until strings frayed, stories retold so vividly that even the most jaded samurai leaned forward, forgetting his blade and his pride. To be an Oiran, the highest-ranking courtesan, was to be more than beautiful. She had to be witty, quick with her tongue, skilled in music, dance, and conversation. She had to weave together flattery and insult, desire and denial, laughter and melancholy. A courtesan who could not entertain a man's mind would not keep him long. Some Oiran became famous for their poetry. Their verses, often scribbled on scraps of paper or brushed across silk fans, captured the fleeting emotions of a night. A single haiku could echo centuries later, preserved by admirers who refused to let the memory die. Others became known for their mastery of fashion. Their robes were layered in colors that set trends across the entire city. When an Oiran changed the way she tied her obi sash, perhaps moving it to the front rather than the back. The streets outside Yoshiwara quickly followed. In this way, courtesans shaped the very image of femininity in Edo Japan. They were, in truth, fashion icons. Their elaborate hairstyles, stiffened with wax and decorated with combs, became the envy of ordinary women. Their lacquered lips and white powdered faces redefined beauty itself. Merchants and artisans in the city watched them closely, eager to replicate their style in dolls and prints, in clothing for those who could never afford to enter Yoshiwara's gates. Then there was Ukiyo-e. The floating world was immortalized in woodblock prints, art that captured the courtesans in poses both intimate and theatrical. These prints traveled far beyond Edo, spreading across Japan and even into Europe centuries later. For the men who could not afford to enter Yoshiwara, the prints offered a fantasy, a chance to gaze upon the unattainable beauty of an Oiran, to imagine her smile, to dream of touching her silk sleeves. In these images, courtesans became something almost divine. They were no longer just women trapped in contracts. They were muses, elevated above ordinary mortals, their names whispered in the same breath as actors, poets, and warriors. But this artistry was not only for the clients, it was also for themselves. In a world where their bodies were sold, courtesans carved out small spaces of self-expression. They used fashion to declare individuality. They used poetry to record sorrow. They used music to soothe their own grief. Behind every performance was a desperate attempt to reclaim humanity in a system designed to strip it away. And yet, for all their art, they remained bound. A courtesan's popularity could rise like a firework, sudden and brilliant. But just as quickly, it could fade. A younger rival might steal her clients. Scandal, a whispered affair with a samurai, a drunken slip of the tongue, a debt unpaid, could ruin her overnight. The floating world adored novelty, and so yesterday's goddess could become today's forgotten woman. Still, there were legends. One such legend tells of Tako II, a courtesan whose beauty was said to rival the blossoms of spring. Men of wealth and power competed for her, offering fortunes for a single night. But Tako was known not just for beauty. She was sharp, clever, unafraid to mock the very men who sought her. She made them laugh, but also kept them trembling, unsure if she loved them or despised them. It is said she once turned down a powerful daimyo, telling him that no amount of gold could buy her heart. Offended, he plotted revenge. Later, she was forced into his service, and when she refused his advances, he had her killed. Whether truth or rumor, her story spread like wildfire. Poets wrote verses about her defiance. Artists carved her face into woodblocks, and even common folk whispered her name. Tako's death turned her into a martyr of beauty and resistance, a symbol of how even in chains, some courtesans refused to bow. Another famous figure was Yoshino Tio, a courtesan celebrated not only for her beauty, but her poetry and elegance. It is said she could quote the great classics of Japanese literature while playing the shamisen, or her voice as soft as falling snow. Men came to her not just for pleasure, but for conversation, for the feeling of being seen and understood. Her fame endured even after her death, preserved in stories, songs, and prints. These women became more than entertainers. They became mirrors of society itself. Through them, Japan's anxieties, desires, and contradictions were revealed. The pleasure houses were both prisons and theaters, places of cruelty and of art, cages where beauty bloomed brightest against the backdrop of suffering. And outside Yoshiwara, the world watched. Merchants saw in the courtesans a reflection of wealth, for only the rich could afford their company. Samurai saw in them a test of honor and self-control. Artists saw in them endless inspiration, muses who embodied the fleeting beauty of life. Even ordinary townsfolk, who could never dream of entering the gates, whispered about them as if they were half myth, half divine. But the irony remained. While the world adored their image, the courtesans themselves often faded into silence. Their art endured, but their names were forgotten. Their robes burned in fires. Their poems crumbled into dust. Only fragments of their lives survived. A verse, a painting, a rumor of a tragic love. And so, the floating world lived up to its name. Place of fleeting pleasures, fleeting beauty, fleeting lives. Imagine standing outside Yoshiwara's great gate. You hear the laughter drifting through paper walls. You see lanterns glowing like captured stars. You smell the sweetness of incense and roasted chestnuts. For a moment, you feel you are peering into another world. A dream spun from silk and candlelight. But you also know that dreams fade. And for every courtesan inside, the dream was never truly hers. The floating world floated, but its women sank. Every dream must end. And for Yoshiwara, the grand stage of Japan's floating world, the decline came slowly at first, like a lantern flickering in the wind. The courtesans, with their silks and powdered faces, their whispered poems and carefully practiced laughter, had long seemed untouchable. They were the muses of poets, the stars of Ukiyo-e prints, the fashion icons of Edo society. But history does not bow to beauty. It sweeps it away. And Yoshiwara was no exception. The first blows came not from men's hearts, but from fire. Wood, paper, silk. The city of Edo was a tinderbox. And Yoshiwara, with its tightly packed brothels and endless lanterns, was especially vulnerable. In 1657, the Great Fire of Mairaki swept across Edo, reducing entire districts to ash. Yoshiwara was destroyed, its women fleeing through smoke-filled streets, clutching what little they could carry. But Yoshiwara was rebuilt. The shogunate, recognizing its usefulness as a controlled outlet for desire, allowed it to rise again. Walls were erected around it, a reminder that pleasure would always be contained, policed, watched. For a time, the floating world glittered brighter than ever. And yet, fire came again. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Yoshiwara burned multiple times. Each fire was a tragedy. Women suffocated in locked rooms, unable to escape. Clients perished alongside them. Streets once alive with laughter became graveyards of ash. But each time, the district was rebuilt, as if Edo itself could not live without this shimmering dream. The floating world was resilient, yes, but each fire chipped away at its illusion. Then came disease. Syphilis spread like shadow through Yoshiwara's chambers. The courtesans, forced to entertain multiple clients in a single night, became vulnerable to infection. In the beginning, it was whispered about. A courtesan would grow pale, her beauty fading, her body weakening. Some tried to hide it with makeup, rouge painted over gray skin, lips red against trembling smiles. But eventually, the disease could not be concealed. Doctors offered treatments, mercury, powders, strange rituals, but nothing truly worked. The women died young, their names struck from the guest books, their memories fading like smoke. And still, men came. They always came. Desire was stronger than fear. But as the centuries turned, something else began to stir. Change. Japan, long sealed from the outside world, opened its gates in the mid-19th century. Foreign ships entered its harbors, their black smoke curling into the sky, their cannons gleaming. The Tokugawa shogunate began to crumble, and with its decline came new ideas. Modernization, westernization, reform. In this new world, Yoshiwara looked less like a jewel and more like a stain. Reformers began to criticize the pleasure houses. They spoke of morality, of progress, of dignity for women. The Meiji government, eager to appear civilized in the eyes of the West, could not ignore the criticism. Laws were passed to regulate the brothels more strictly. Inspections increased. The courtesan's freedom, already so thin, was tightened further by paperwork, by bureaucracy, by the cold hands of officials who measured bodies as though they were livestock. And yet the district endured. Even as the world around it modernized, trains rattling through Tokyo, factories rising, newspapers spreading news at lightning speed, Yoshiwara clung to its old rhythms. Lanterns still glowed at night. The shamisen still played. Men still wandered in, hoping to lose themselves in silks and sake. But the magic was fading. The Ukiyo-e prints that once immortalized courtesans now turned their gaze elsewhere, to landscapes, to new technologies, to the wonders of a changing Japan. Courtesans were no longer the stars of art. They were relics. Then, in 1913, Yoshiwara burned again. This time, the fire was devastating. Thousands of buildings were reduced to ash. The courtesans fled once more, some never returning. When the district was rebuilt, it lacked the old grandeur. The narrow lanes and high walls gave way to something plainer, cheaper, more modern. And then came the earthquake. In 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake ripped through Tokyo, leveling vast parts of the city. Fires followed, swallowing what little had survived. Yoshiwara was reduced to ruins once more. Survivors described a hellscape, collapsed brothels trapping women inside. Flames racing faster than footsteps, screams echoing through the rubble.
The floating world had been smashed apart by the earth itself.
Still astonishingly, Yoshiwara rose again, but now it was a shadow. The courtesans no longer held the same allure. Modern forms of entertainment, dance halls, movie theaters, competed for men's attention. Why spend a fortune on one night with a courtesan when the city itself now offered endless distractions? Even the image of the courtesan changed, no longer seen as divine muses. They were spoken of as sad figures, relics of an older, darker Japan. Their elaborate kimonos seemed outdated compared to the sleek dresses of the modern girl. Their shamisen songs sounded old-fashioned compared to the jazz spilling out of Tokyo's new clubs. By the time World War II arrived, Yoshiwara was already in steep decline. Bombings during the war destroyed much of what remained. And when the war ended, the U.S. occupation forces cracked down on prostitution. Yoshiwara limped on for a few years, but the world it had represented, the floating world of silk, lanterns, and carefully staged desire, was gone. The gates were closed, the lanterns extinguished. All that was left were stories. Stories of women whose names once echoed across Edo. Stories of men who ruined themselves in pursuit of a night's dream. Stories of fashion, poetry, music, and art born in prison-like chambers. Stories of fire, of ash, of rebirth, of final silence. Today, if you wander through Tokyo, you may still find streets where Yoshiwara once stood. The buildings are different. Air smells of exhaust rather than incense. Neon signs flicker where lanterns once glowed. Few remember the women who lived and died there. And yet, if you close your eyes, you might still hear it. The faint strum of a shamisen, the whisper of a poem, the rustle of silk sleeves. Ghosts linger in the city, carrying with them the beauty and the sorrow of Japan's floating world. Because Yoshiwara was never just a place. It was an illusion, a dream, a mirror of everything humanity desires and everything it fears. And dreams, even when they end, do not vanish. They remain, drifting in memory, forever part of the night. And so, the story drifts to its end. The lanterns of Yoshiwara have long since gone dark, their paper shades turned to ash, their glow replaced by the electric neon of modern Tokyo. The courtesans, once stars of the floating world, have vanished into history, their names scattered like petals in the wind. Yet, though the gates are gone, the dream remains. The floating world was never only about flesh, it was about escape. About the yearning for beauty in a life bound by rules. About a society that built a garden of illusions where men could play at freedom. And women, though caged, wielded the power of desire and art. Behind painted lips and silk robes, courtesans carried secrets, sorrow, and a brilliance that lit the imagination of an entire nation. Their poems are still read. Their likenesses, captured in Ukiyo-e prints, still hang in museums, gazed upon by eyes centuries removed. Their legacy lingers in fashion and art, in the very rhythm of Japanese culture. When you think of Yoshiwara, do not think only of brothels. Think of a stage where humanity's deepest contradictions danced, beauty and suffering, freedom and captivity, wealth and ruin, love and transaction. Think of the women who lived as dreams, knowing they would be forgotten. Think of the men who sought comfort in illusions, knowing the morning would shatter them. And then ask yourself, was Yoshiwara truly a prison? Or was it, in some strange way, a mirror of all our lives, fleeting, fragile, illuminated by moments of beauty before fading into the dark? Because we, too, live in a floating world. One day, our cities, our pleasures, our names will vanish. But the dreams we create, the art, the whispers, the stories, those linger, just as the ghosts of Yoshiwara linger still. So, when the night grows quiet and the world feels heavy, close your eyes. Listen for the distant strum of the shamisen. Feel the brush of silk against your skin. Smell the faint trace of incense fading on the wind. For in that moment, you are there inside Japan's pleasure houses, walking through the dream of the floating world. And though the dream is gone, you carry it now, forever.